Hi, my name is Tibs. Since January, I've been a developer educator at Ivan, but before that I was a programmer, mostly using Python, C and a variety of other languages. As a programmer, the Docs as tool approach seems to me very natural. And also as a programmer, I tended to leave a trail of documentation behind me anyway, mostly using restructured text in the last few years. I've been using it since it came out, and before that other markups. What I want to talk about today is some of the things we can learn from the programming world about how to automatically check our text documents. We all know writing documentation is hard, and spotting errors in that documentation is even harder. So what can we do to help? Well, the best thing is to get someone else, another human being, to review the text for us. But that's not always possible. We might be the only documenter in a company. And also, actually, there are other things we can do that will find things that won't necessarily be spotted in review. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by talking about automated checking, linting. I'll look a bit at some of the sorts of checks we might make, a bit of a shopping list. I'll look at whether we should adopt existing checks or grow our own. I'll talk briefly about some tools we can use. I'll talk about how you plumb those tools and checks into the Docs as code approach. And I'll briefly talk about what we actually do at Ivan at the end. So lint was a program written in 1978 to find common errors and stylistic problems in C code. Lint is the name for bits of fluff on fabric, so linting is the technique of plucking them off the fabric. Hence linting code to take out the bad things, the little bad bits. It's intended to do simple checks that can be fast and can give good results. It's perfectly possible in C to write programs that are valid C but don't do quite what you want. And the way C is constructed, some of the things that are valid are very close in the characters to things that do something different. Those can be very hard to spot. It may just be the difference between an equals and two equals signs in an expression. So the linters were written to find those problems by looking for particular kinds of text pattern. This works very well for programming code. It's now widely adopted across many programming languages. It's a little bit harder for human written text because spoken language, written language is not as restricted in its syntax as code, but it's still a worthwhile approach. So let's have a look at some checks we might make. We're going to look at example messages. These aren't necessarily real messages. Much of this is inspired by what we can do with the tool we use, but not all of it. And I don't promise that all of these checks are actually things you can do with particular tools. Let's start with spelling. We hopefully all use spelling checkers. So our error message here is arglebargle does not seem to be a word. So spell checking basically works by looking a word up in a dictionary. A dictionary might be just a list of all the possible words that we consider to be correct. It might be something more complex, a structure of word prefixes and possible affixes, and you can combine the prefixes and affixes to make up that total set of words. It might be something else entirely. We might have more than one dictionary for standard words, one dictionary for business-specific words, one dictionary for medical terms. We'll probably ignore numbers. We don't want to have to specify all the possible numbers in a list. And we'll probably ignore some but not all punctuation. Remember that can't, C-A-N''T, is a word. Note that we can only report mistakes. We can't say this word is definitely correct. Consider the there problem. They are, there it belongs to, and there over there. Those all have different meanings. But a spell checker can't hope to tell you whether you've used them correctly or not. But what if I really did mean arglebargle? Maybe my text says, for this we shall invent the term arglebargle. So what can we do? We can put up with it. We can say, yes, we're getting an error, but we're going to ignore it. Now, our experience from the programming world is that this is a bad thing to do, and the reason is that if you have a culture of having your checker output error messages that you're going to ignore, first of all, it's hard to spot the good error messages from the bad error messages, and just pick out which ones you actually want as opposed to the ones you're ignoring. And secondly, the human eye will naturally grow used to ignoring error messages, and after a while you'll just say, yeah, there's some error messages, I'll just ignore them all. We can maybe, if we're lucky, mark the term up differently. So many checkers, for instance, will be set to ignore literal text. So in Markdown, that would be things in single backticks. In restructured text, they would be surrounded by paired backticks. If that approach works, it's a very good one. We may be able to put comments or some other sort of markup into the text itself to say, switch linting off and then switch it back on. If we're very lucky, we'll be able to say, switch the linting off for spelling and back on again, or possibly even switch the linting off for spelling arglebargle. The disadvantage of that approach is you have to actually mark the document up. Maybe that's an advantage. We may be able to configure the checker to say, ignore arglebargle. That's okay, but presumably arglebargle is not valid in all places, so this may be a bit overkill. Lastly, if we're lucky, we may be able to say, ignore arglebargle in this file at that location, perhaps specifying a line number, perhaps specifying a paragraph by some mechanism. And this leads us to the idea that, unfortunately, we probably can't do autocorrection. Written text is complicated. Linting's going to find false positives. Also, I'm sure we all know the stories about an author who decides to change the name of a character in their story, does autocorrect, and discovers they've now changed the middles of unexpected words. So the final decision should be with a human. Let's look at another check. Don't say that. There are words and phrases we know don't work really well in documentation. Simply and obvious tend to be that. So we might want to warn against using the phrase, it is obvious that. These are a good value for the amount of effort to create these chests. And then we have used this instead of that. We may have a colleague who typically mistypes ADN instead of AND, or perhaps they'd appreciate having a check that will warn them about this. We may, like me, not be able to spell supersede. Now, it's all very well having the spell checker saying no word supersede, but I'd actually rather have it say use this correct spelling instead of that incorrect spelling. Lastly, at Ivan, we sell services provided by other companies. It's very important that we not appear to claim that we own their service. So if we talk about Ivan Redis, it sounds as if we are owning Redis. And the correct way to refer to this is to say Ivan for Redis. This acknowledges that we're providing Redis as a service, but it's not us that made Redis. So it's quite important that we find this sort of check in our text. But it's not always an error. Warnings can be useful too. So we also use a product called Flink. We don't tend to use the word flick. It's not really relevant to technical documentation, but we do occasionally have cases where someone has written flick instead of flink. So we have a check to find that and warn us about it. I used to work at a company with a good number of Japanese colleagues, and I was told that they did not tend to understand easily the EGIE abbreviations that many English speakers use from their vague knowledge of some bit of Latin. Instead, it's better to say, for instance, for example, and so on. I actually tend to think this is a good practice in general. But here we've introduced the distinction between errors and warnings. An error must be fixed because the document is wrong, but a warning is just a warning, a suggestion. So what do you do after you get a warning? We've already said having error messages come out, or in this case warnings that you ignore, isn't necessarily a great idea. If it's a warning and we want to keep the wording as it is, that's not something we want to fix. And if we can't actually put annotations somewhere to say this, well, we've got a dilemma. I don't have a good solution for this. It's going to be a case-by-case basis. You'll have to make decisions yourselves and learn as you go what you can actually do. Also, we were talking about the person who mistypes ADN. Maybe they leave the team. Maybe there was only one person who did that and not lots of us. We probably don't need that check anymore. Now, actual real tools aren't going to care too much about how many checks there are. They're going to cope with lots of them and still run speedily. This matters more than the fact that you're going to have to maintain all the checks. You have to go over them periodically and make sure they're still correct. Hopefully you're testing them a little bit. I'm not going to address that in this talk. Cognitive load of having lots of tests, which perhaps not all of them are relevant anymore. Keep pruning tests that you don't need. So for instance, if we stopped using the Flink product, we wouldn't need the Flick test. Another check. Inconsistent spelling of centre and centre. I've got a document where I've used centre and I've used centre, the two different spellings in the same document. Ivan, like many companies, uses US English for our developer documentation. I naturally type British English and I use that at home. So it's not impossible that I'll use both spellings in one document. It's more useful for me to get an error like this as well as being told that I've misspelt centre. This is my favourite check. If this thing is present, then we also need to have that thing. So we'll start with the first one. Who has no definition. So WHO is an acronym. And normally it's polite the first time an acronym occurs to explain it. So we want our text to say WHO brackets World Health Organization, and ideally that would be the first time it occurs. We might generalize, so we can do a specific text to say if there's WHO, we want to see brackets World Health Organization after it. But we might generalize that to say if we've got a word of 3 or more capitals, pretty much nearly certain to be an acronym, then after it we want brackets, some text, close brackets. A different case, and one specific to our documentation, is that we talk about other people's products and services, and they have rules about how we refer to them, and we must acknowledge that they are registered trademarks, and that means that we must put the R symbol after those words in sufficient places. So here we have a rule saying that at least one use of PostgreSQL in this case must be marked as registered in a document. Now actually we probably want to say the first use. So this is an extension as to whether the checking use is that. There's also a case to say it's nice to be able to check for the last use of something. I've been talking about words, which are things in dictionaries. We kind of understand what we mean by words. But if we're talking about parsing, this comes from the software community, then we will use the term token, which basically means the atom that you're interested in, the thing you don't divide down any smaller, and that might be a phrase. And lastly, we also want to talk about patterns, expressions. So consider the case of the 3 or more letters that are uppercase. We might use regular expressions to describe those. You'll probably come across all 3 usages in any checker you use and bear all of them in mind. I'll probably just keep saying word, I suspect. Scope is another thing. We don't necessarily want to check all of the document. We may want to restrict our test to part of it. So for instance, we might want to check that says thing must be used with a registered mark in the first title to use the name. We might have another check which is complementary to say it must also be used with an R mark in the first non-title to use the name, the first body text. Or we might just say actually we want to just check it for the very first time it occurs in the whole document. So being able to scope a check to a particular part of the document is very powerful. So, capitalisation. Here we're considering headings. It's quite common to have capitalisation rules for headings. It must be sentence case. The first word must be capital and not the rest. It might be that all of the words need to start with capitals. So in this case, badly capitalised heading should be in sentence case. But we need to consider carefully, what about the word iPhone? It starts with a lowercase and then a capital letter. What about NASA, another of our acronyms? What about remembering Terry Jones? The name Terry Jones needs to have capitals. It's important to be able to specify exceptions, and we don't want to just say ignore the word Terry. We want to be able to say when we're doing capitalisation checks, we want to ignore the phrase Terry Jones. And this kind of being able to do exceptions for particular rules is a very useful technique. Some checks go beyond the text itself, but perhaps to the structure and other things. We'll look at those now. And the first is looking at the raw text. So at Ivan we use restructured text for our developer documentation, but we write our blog posts using Markdown. So that inevitably means that people end up writing both, and it's therefore easy to write Markdown in restructured text and vice versa, which doesn't go so well. So here are some checks that can help with that. For restructured text, one backtick without a rows becomes italics. If you write backtick word backtick, it'll come out in italics. It's expecting to specify a role before it, which will say what to do with it, and the default is to be in italics. That's probably not what you wanted. You were probably trying to do 2 backticks around it to make it into literal. If I've been writing Markdown and go to restructured text, I'll often mistakenly use the Markdown inline link format in restructured text. That really doesn't work well. So it's useful to have a warning that says I've done that. Strangely, I don't do it the other way around. And for Markdown, if you type 2 backticks, at least in the Markdown we use, it'll still work. You'll still get a literal out, but it's not actually real Markdown. So it would be better to warn people about it. And different Markdowns, of course, may treat it differently. For alt text, we want to say that all images should have alt text. So we want to check for something that is missing and warn people when it's missing. This is not the same as having a check for something being 0 length. We're actually wanting to check that a structural element occurs 0 times. In HTML, we're checking for the alt equals being present in an image tag, and in restructured text, we're looking for the ::: inside an image directive. This is quite a powerful technique. I'm not quite sure how to do it in Veil yet. I'm still exploring. Sometimes arbitrary metrics are useful. I don't know the use case for these, but I know they're a thing that some companies respect, and I'm assuming that because they exist, they are useful. So we might want to say the flush Kincaid grade level has to be below 8. And this is calculated by looking at the document and counting things and doing sums on them. So here is the maths for that measure. You may find that your checker understands the names of particular metrics and you can just choose them. You may find that you have to specify the maths for the actual algorithm to use. And possibly the most powerful tool in our toolbox that scares me a little bit is natural language processing, to allow you to categorize the words in a sentence by what part of speech they are and then make decisions based on that. The reason this is a bit scary to me is that certainly when I was taught English at school, as a school child, we didn't really do grammar. So once you've gone beyond nouns and verbs and adjectives, I get a bit lost. So to use NLP, I have to have a cheat sheet to remind me of what all the bits are. But let's consider wanting to distinguish cars are with possessive, which is almost certainly a mistake, from cars are where it's a plural. Here we're saying if we've got a noun that's followed by apostrophe s and the word are, we probably meant a noun with an s and the word are. The second one, don't use like as an interjection. Like was raised by David McKeever on Twitter recently as can you check for this sort of thing, like. Because he finds it irritating when people use like as an interjection in their words. I think NLP lets you do that. It lets you find out whether you're saying I like that or whether the word is just in no context. It also really needs you to be saying the word like when you're quoting it in some way you can distinguish as well. Otherwise, talking about like as the word would be difficult. But here you could probably mark it up in literal. This is also probably how you can distinguish between there, and there. They're all different parts of speech, and so we should have the power to do this here. Finally, this depends a bit on your actual checker. Some checkers use a programming approach to add new plugins anyway, although they're using very restricted sets of copy this bit of program and alter it. So you're not really programming in a wide sense, but sometimes it's useful to just say give me the full access to the structure of the document. I can wander around the document, I can do what I like and write the ultimate check for, well, I don't know. I hope this isn't something you need to do, but being able to reach into the toolbox for this might occasionally be useful. So what should we use to start our task? Should we use pre-built packages or should we design it by hand? So it's very useful to be able to say, well, I'll just adopt the Microsoft style or the Google style. You can sell that to your managers very easily. They probably know what these are. It means you don't have to describe anything. You just say, hey, we'll just adopt that. It's well documented. It's over there. You might want to do that and add customizations or even possibly remove things. Or you might want to start from scratch and specify everything yourself. This is the approach we've taken. We didn't know quite what we wanted to check. We knew specific things and we're building up slowly and learning as we go. We're quite likely to actually add in one of the existing style packages later on, now we've got more experience. If you do write your own checks, consider contributing them back to the community if they're useful. I have an ambition to contribute the registered mark checker rules back at some point. There are quite a few tools that you might potentially use. I'm just going to give a brief overview of some that, hey, I found by Googling or looking at other people's documents about how to do this sort of thing. I'm going to start with Veil because that's the one we use, and then look at some others. I haven't used any of them except Veil, I should point, so I'm just going to reiterate what I've learnt from reading their websites. Veil itself supports checking in a variety of markup languages, and also comments and doctrines in code, which I find very attractive. It specifies rules by using YAML files, it calls them styles, and they build on existing concepts we've already come across. You can also escape into code in a Go-like language if you really want to. I think that's relatively unlikely to be necessary. And there are various prepackaged rule sets, the aforementioned Microsoft, Google, etc. This is new since earlier in the year. So you don't need to start with Veil from a blank start. You can pull in a package that already exists. LTeX or LTeX and LanguageTool. So LTeX is the command line front end to LanguageTool, which is, I guess, in some ways an open source equivalent to Grammarly. It supports another different set of markup languages. You can see its LaTeX background showing here. It supports multiple languages, and new rules are stored as XML files. So I think that counts as relatively friendly, especially if you come from a Java, LaTeX, sort of big infrastructure kind of world. Alex is a slightly different sort of tool that definitely deserves mentioning. It's designed to catch insensitive, inconsiderate writing in Markdown documents and offer alternatives. Now this is interesting because it's got one task that's very constrained, and that is to tell you, you may not have realised it, but you might have done something you didn't want to do. So for instance, if I'm writing a document about the legal system and I use the word criminal, I'm almost certainly okay, I'm talking about criminals. But if I'm talking about something social or about friends or about something else and I use the word criminal, I may be using it in a pejorative sense that will cause people to be a bit upset. And Alex will point that out to me and say, could you use this instead? It's a good tool for teaching you of things you didn't realise you were doing and spotting them for you. As such, it will definitely find things where it doesn't need to, but that's the point. It's meant to expand your horizons of what you should be looking for. And several of the other checkers have either Alex equivalent or similar technologies built into them. Proslint runs checks on Markdown files. It comes with its own set of checks built in, and new plugins are written in Python. If you're a Python programmer, that's obviously going to feel friendly to you. Redpen, again, looks at a variety of markup languages. It's another one that explicitly supports multiple languages. It's got a catalogue of existing validators, and new validators can be written in Java or JavaScript. I rather like the two languages chosen there of different ends of the complexity and largeness scale. TextLint again supports Markdown and plain text, but it's got plugins to support other markup languages. It starts with no rules, but you use npm to install them, and new rules are written as plugins using JavaScript. So if you're used to JavaScript and npm, this is going to fit your comfort space very well. So how do we plumb our checks into docs as code? Well, we might have local checks which we run in the editor, either as you're typing, if they're very quick, or perhaps on saving the document if they take a little bit longer. And at the command line, we can run our command to make the checks. And all of those tools can be run as command line tools. We might consider having the checks before commit to the version control system, and maybe don't allow the commit if there are errors. This may be a bit extreme. When I was a programmer, I know programmers who really got upset by not being able to commit something because the checks were failing. You definitely want to have an option in that case to say, I know there are errors, I'd like to commit anyway. And this might be because you want other people to look at the code, to review it, to help to figure out what the errors are, perhaps. You almost certainly want checks to run before a review. The reviewers then can then see the results of the checks and help comment on them, help work out what to do about them. You should probably consider forbidding merging to your main branch if there are errors. This seems a more reasonable approach. And GitHub has workflows for this. You quite probably want to check before you deploy or release your documentation, and maybe you want to refuse to deploy if there are errors. this is probably a good idea. And if you've already had the other checks in progress, by the time you get to deployment, hopefully there won't be any errors. And if you've got a continuous integration flow chain going, then you probably want to run the checks automatically when a reviewer is requested. That's the pull request, as we talked about earlier, or before deploying the documentation. And again, one's hoping that by the time you get to deployment, all the errors have been sorted. At Ivan, we lint our developer documentation. The link at the left is where the documentation lives, and the link at the right is where the actual code for the documentation lives, the restructured text. It's an open source project. Please feel free to come along and look at it. You can see how we use Veil, and please feel free to contribute. All contributions gratefully accepted. We use Veil. I think it's come across by now. It's a small program, it's fast, it's portable, it's very configurable. Development is active and ongoing, the code is readable, the author fixes bugs quickly, and it's well known in the Write the Docs community. If there are any snags with it, it's that it's a relatively small project, it's just one maintainer, and you do need to configure it. Well, except that now, since a few months ago, you can pull in the pre-packaged setups, so you can do as I said, Microsoft, Google, etc. We use the spelling style check, so we're using the default US English Dictionary plus our own. We use capitalization to check for capitalization in headings. We use substitution to do the use this instead of that. You've already seen some instances of that. And we use the conditional checks, the if this then that, for our registration mark checking. We're going to grow more checks over time, and as I say, we're quite likely to pull in a prepackaged solution as well. At the command line, we run it by saying make spell. We've altered our Sphinx makefile to do this. I'm ambivalent about whether it should be make lint, but make spell is much more familiar and people are more likely to remember it. In continuous integration, we use Veil action, which is the official GitHub action for Veil. And that's available on the GitHub repository of actions as well. So we run checks for a PR, that is for a pull request, and when pushing to main. It says in theory because actually currently the workflow is set up for pushing to master. We didn't update it when we changed the name of the main branch. So that's a thing we still need to fix. So what have we learnt? We can check things beyond spelling. Relatively simple techniques can be useful. Doesn't need to be terribly complicated, indeed it shouldn't. We shouldn't check for the sake of it. So remember to curate your tests. There is a good choice of tools available. There's probably something for everyone. You don't have to build it yourself. You can probably pull in pre-set up stuff. Most of the tools come with a set of rules already built in that the creators of the tool thought were useful. And you can check as part of your Docs as Code toolchain. There's a Write the Docs Slack channel called Test the Docs. The slides and accompanying materials are at this GitHub repository, and the QR code will take you there as well. This is written in restructured text and converted to PDF using RST to PDF, which is wonderful. And lastly, I work at ivan.io. We're hiring across all the field of everything we do, and you can find me on Twitter as @muchofa. Thank you.
But yeah, thank you both for your lovely talks here at Write the Docs. And maybe I can get started with some of the Q&A. We were talking now about marketing. So one of the questions that we got from the audience is that some marketing teams like to hide information under some sort of contact us thing, whereas in technical documentation, it's available there. It's really available. And what's your advice for solving this contradiction?
I'm not sure to what extent. I think it's a great question, and I haven't really thought of this before, so it really put me on the spot. But I don't really see too much of a contradiction, because it's, for me, marketing has a good reason most of the time, I suppose, to hide some of the content. And basically, they want to get contact details. That's what they need, an email address most of the time. And that's why you need to give your email address to get your white paper or some kind of product trial or whatever. I think for documentation, it's not necessarily an issue. So, I mean, or there may be one point of conflict would be where documentation would like to make something publicly available, whereas marketing would say, oh, no, this should go into the white paper. And unsurprisingly, I'm not sure I have a kind of a very clear way of saying kind of siding on either one of these arguments. I would say that in these cases, probably establishing some sort of criteria about kind of what would make sense for publicly available information, and what's the value of kind of getting those contact details from the clients, and this criteria could kind of encompass questions about is it about the use of our product? If it's about a procedure, we don't want to hide this in a PDF somewhere that you need to give your contact details to obtain. And I think that's probably that's something that we can actually convince marketers that it would make it would actually drive away more people if a simple procedure for a simple procedure they would need to give contact details and jump many hurdles. So it's all about kind of also speaking their language, so marketers' language, about, okay, so you're saying that you get contact details, that's a benefit, but how many people are going to be driven away if you are if you're hiding simple basic information in something for which you need to sign up? So yeah, this kind of conversation can go a long way. So I'm not sure I'm answering this to the fullest, but yeah, here are just some ideas.
Yeah, I guess there's always a it depends kind of way for most questions.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Tibs, you mentioned that your developer relations team sits within the marketing organization. Mm-hmm. Have you had to deal with this tension between one part wanting to expose more information than the other part?
Not really. The marketing team have personas that include developers and so on, and they're quite aware of the fact that developers are resistant to giving information in order to get information. That does make it harder to do tracking for development documentation sites, because obviously we'd love to know how many people are looking at our docs, but if we're too intrusive, they won't stay there. It's not. It's not something I really. Being an ex-developer, I can give the developer's viewpoint, and we have a lot of those around, so we can ask them. But I don't know the marketing side of it very well. I defer to Mana as knowing much more about it, I think. But I think personas seems to be the right way to go, and I love the concept of personas. Mm. So.
Yeah, I agree. My role is in product management, so it's something I'm dealing with frequently.
No, I'm a tech writer, so I'm also kind of not very knowledgeable about the marketing side of things. On our side, especially what you mentioned about developers being resistant to not just to give up information, but also to they're very resistant of big words and empty promises. So if they see something that you cannot substantiate, they will most likely jump in 2 seconds. I think that's an argument that could be made for making as much information available publicly, especially in a developer-focused company, because when they see a competitor who offers everything on just readily available, and you see people, you see a website where you need to sign up and talk to a person who would want to kind of send you up for a demo and everything, I think developers would always opt for the first option. It's just a guess, but I think a pretty good one.
Yeah, that's true. Moving on to a different kind of question, Tibs, in one of our previous talks, Emilia was talking about the maintenance of documentation and how important it is to keep docs up to date. And we got a question from the audience now about how do you review and update the rules regularly? Kind of like, how do you maintain the rules of the documentation?
So we developer documentation in the kind of state we're moving towards has only been around for a year and a half now, I think. And so the rules, I think, when I joined, we already had Veil for running the rules and so on, and we had a fairly good set of checking spellings of things, capitalization of things. One of my first jobs was to add the registered trademark checking, because that's really quite important when we're talking about Apache products and other things like that. It's polite, and it's also required to get those things correct. We're still working out how would we add new rules. We don't yet have enough rules to be doing much triage to remove old ones. So we're still in an add-in phase. We knew we wanted to add checking for alt text missing, because we make that mistake a lot. I wanted the check for doing the markdown link in restructured text, because I make that mistake quite often. Both of those I wrote yesterday, so there are PRs out for those now. And we have, in the back of our minds, we have some other rules that we would like, and we will generate issues for those. But at the moment, we don't have the time. We're busy on other things. We're porting our documentation from an old documentation system to a new one. That's taking up most of the time. It's conference season at the moment. And because it's DevRel is mostly in charge of the developer documentation at the moment, everything slows down in conference season. But ultimately, we'll do it by using issues and PRs in the normal way. We'll brainstorm for things we think might be needed. We've got the bare minimum at the moment of what really makes life easy, I think. And we'll have eventually to judge, when do we stop? When is it too many rules? We're also really seriously thinking that at some point we might want to adopt a package of rules. Maybe we'll go Google, Microsoft, whatever, so that we can just say, hey, these people have put a lot of thought into this. Let's adopt it. But again, we haven't even started looking at that yet.
Yeah, kind of going off of what you just answered, one of the questions we had is if there are APIs exposed from the popular grammar tools that you think are worth integrating, or that you can integrate to your linting.
I have a personal distrust of grammar tools, because I remember Word when it was really bad at this sort of thing. We're an international company. A lot of our developers, technical writers, marketing people, English is not their first language. And I personally, this isn't a company response, this is just me, feel that trying to perfect the grammar, trying to follow arbitrary grammar rules would probably cause us to have a bit more time fiddling with documentation. We also, our development site is open source, so anyone can contribute in theory. I mean, in practice, we'd love them to. We haven't had many external contributors, but it's a good idea. So we'd have to have tools that could be run by people who weren't in company. We also have to consider that we couldn't use something like Grammarly, for instance, because we don't want text going outside the company and then coming back in. That makes our security people very unhappy. So I think that I don't know of anything we'd use directly. The LTeX tool I was talking about in the talk is probably the closest to something we might do for something like that. We haven't explored that very much. I think there are too many other low-level things we can do first. It's definitely something to think about longer term, though, because I think as time goes on and tools are getting more sophisticated, they're getting better at doing things. And my attitude from when Word was new is very outdated, and I probably should revisit it.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I think it's an interesting angle thinking about it. It's not just internal to the company, but if you want people to contribute, your tools need to be available for everyone to use.
Yes.
Yeah. Now jumping to a different kind of question. Mono, I think everyone really enjoyed the imagery you used in the different kinds of documentation. So one of the questions we did get is like, so if you have a landing page or a normal docs or API reference docs, maybe they look different because they fulfill different communication goals, or they have different personas or people looking at them. I guess, what's your take on that?
No, that's actually a pretty good remark. And I also liked the conversation you generated in the chat. Personally, what I kind of, in the second half of the talk, I did make it clear that, of course, it makes a lot of sense that marketing text and technical documentation have different, we have different expectations from the language itself, or from the purpose. From those perspectives, we would want to see some. It makes sense to have different slightly different stylistic conventions and stuff. But at the same time, the point I try to make is that for users, or as Sam mentioned, for anyone, like just human beings coming to a website and seeing this a very disjointed experience is not going to invite them to try our product further, or it's not going to be a good experience. So I think a good developer experience, or any experience, comes from the fact that you'll stay in the flow. And that kind of requires a lot of harmonization between the different parts of the website. It doesn't mean that everything needs to look the same, but just having a unified way of navigation, on like top navigation, or a unified look and feel. Just the fact that you are kept in the flow by first going. It doesn't have to necessarily be the first page. The marketing landing page is just a placeholder. Another commenter, I think, rightly said that when you are searching through Google, any page can be a landing page, and that's true. But what I meant is, like, whenever you start, you can easily go to whichever part of the whole website and go through the experience of, I want to learn about the features, or what I can do with this. I want to learn how to do stuff. I want to go to the trial. I want to sign up for the sales through the sales form, and I want to open a support ticket. And all the point I wanted to make is that you need to be, throughout this user journey, you want to give a unified experience where they are kept in the flow. And if all these different parts are managed by very different teams with different conventions and different tools and different styles or just look and feel, you are not going to make the lives of users as easy as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you make. Like, just because we have different people writing it, it doesn't mean it doesn't have to feel like 3 different experiences, even if they are optimized to different personas or different people looking at it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end of this Q&A session. Thank you, Manu, and thank you, Tibs, for your lovely talks and for answering the questions from everyone. And we're now going to head into lunch. And I just wanted to remind everyone about the lightning talks that are happening at 2:25 Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.